So Bomber is talking to an NBR senior journalist called Maria Slade, and the question is talking about Christopher Luxon as a negotiator, Christopher Luxon and his business competence, and how that transposes across. We'll have a look at that, and then we'll continue on. Let's have a look at what they had to say.
Maria, we have been told Chris Luxon is a great corporate manager and deal maker. By setting up APEC as a deadline and failing, how is the great corporate manager and deal maker doing so far?
To me, this is an example of where a good businessman doesn't necessarily make a good politician, and vice versa, I might say.
Right.
Mainzeal board, anybody? People...
Very unkind.
Very fair, though. Very fair.
People say, oh, he was a good businessman, he's going to be a great leader. In business, what you do is you thump the desk and you say this will happen, and your staff will run around and make it happen.
Yep.
In politics...
Really? Doesn't work in my business.
Damien hasn't been doing it right.
Yeah, well, that is because you were running it, Damien, I think. No. I mean...
The old Damien.
No, so what you're saying...
But that's what we were saying all the way through the election, yeah? Luxon is not used to pushback. Luxon won't be used to people going, fuck that. Luxon won't be used to having, people resist his direction. Because as the CEO of a massive company, you go, thump the desk, let's do this. Let's do this. All right, let's consult with my senior managers. Now I'll say, let's do this. Doesn't work in politics. Doesn't work in this situation.
Saying is that we're good at politics.
He's got a harder stone.
Lord help us.
Harder stone.
Lord help us. No, look, I think that, he seemed to think that he could just sort of, make this happen. But the thing is, in business, if you're trying to negotiate a deal, you could just keep throwing money at the problem, and eventually the party that you're trying to take over, or whatever it is, may agree if you make the terms attractive enough. This is not that situation.
Correct.
This is not a situation of just keep upping the ante.
Yeah.
You are trying to please three disparate groups on some quite... philosophical matters, such as treaty referendums. It's not a question of, we'll have a bit of a treaty referendum, or something like that. It's far more complicated, I think, and so perhaps that's where Luxon has overestimated his own skills a wee bit.
Plus,
maybe.
in business, you can walk away.
Sure.
You don't have to
Yes.
do the deal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In politics, he has,
don't have a
and I
choice,
think
eh?
that he thought that in business you can walk away, and often the smaller parties can't.
Here we go.
But this is around the other way. He's the only guy who can't walk away. Both New Zealand First
And
ACT can say,
That's
we'll
right.
just go to the crossbenchers.
Yeah.
And I just don't think perhaps he had thought about that as carefully as he might have.
Maria,
But he has no underlying principles. How hard is it for him to just cave in on stuff? I mean, why doesn't he just say to Winston and act fine, whatever? Well, tell me what you want to do. I mean, that's what Helen Clark did. Not Helen Clark, Jacinda Ardern did.
Jacinda.
Well, because probably there are a few wise people that are
in the
saying
National
things
Party will
like
be saying, don't let them do any of this.
unfunded tax, not obviously not in the caucus, but outside, there'll be people saying, look, a referendum is not the right way to deal with those co-governance issues. There'll be people saying, look, unfunded tax cuts would raise interest rates. There'll be people saying those things, and I think he's able to hear those things and say them again.
Question, Maria.
Yeah, I see people in the chat saying that Hooton was on fire last night. He was incredibly sarcastic and you got to be careful. It's a little bit like, what's her name? Dick Cheney's daughter, Cheney, over in America. All of a sudden, she became a darling of the left because she stood up to Trump. Her policy and stuff was still pretty repugnant all the way through, and Hooton is still very much neoliberal person that sits on the right. Those are things he wants, but he's also smart and he's a good communicator. So when you say he's on fire, he was very entertaining last night, and he was incredibly sarcastic all the way through. And who doesn't love some good sarcasm? I know I certainly do. Liz Cheney, thank you very much, Vicky. Liz Cheney, it was indeed. Yeah, exactly, Mr. Anderson. He's hideous but hilarious. I don't know if he's hideous, but yeah. But as is it Satiric Games says, Liz Cheney, and she's no hero. No, you're right. But the left clinged on to her desperately as soon as she started saying negative things about Trump. But then if you look at her voting record, it's pretty icky to look at. So I know it gets a bit frustrating for you guys, because we've all talked about this for such a long time. You and I and Chewy and all of our guests have talked about how the business, I'm a businessman, I've got business skills, is not transposable over to government. And the simple answer and reason for that is running a country is very different from running a business. It's the same for local body. When a whole bunch of people were like, I'm a businessman, I should be mayor. Running a city, it's not the same. The idea of a business primarily is to return a dividend, a profit, to the owner or the shareholders, right? That's what it is. The idea of a country or a city is to supply services to your citizens. If you were going to run a country or a city like a business, you'd get rid of not-for-profits. The library doesn't give us any money. The library doesn't return a dividend to a shareholder, but it does supply a service to a customer, to a citizen. So it's not the same. And I've said this for years. If you were going to say a business person's skills are transposable to politics, maybe the CEO of a not-for-profit, like the CEO of a World Vision type group or something like that, or a tier fund, or a, Gumboot Friday, or whatever they are. Because in those situations, they do have things like targets and budgets, and they have to look after marketing and all those things, but their objective in the end is to supply a service or to help rather than return a dividend. So they've got all the same jobs to do as a CEO of a business, but they have a different focus. So in my humble opinion, the only sort of CEO's skills that are directly transposable to leader of a city or a country would be someone who is a CEO of a not-for-profit, an NGO, that's supplying their customers with a service, not returning a dividend to its shareholders. Just some thoughts. A country's citizens are not employees, says Brother Monk. Brother Monk. Felix says, feels like we all understand that, but Nat's voters can't grasp that fact. I'm not sure if that's directly to me or someone who was talking to you beforehand, Felix. But in general, this is what's happened here. And we said this the other night. The only thing that people who voted for National can now claim hold of that's still the same is hatred for Labour. So the hatred for Labour means anyone but Labour. That's still valid for those people because anyone but Labour will get in. However, all the promises made by National, all the promises made by ACT, all the promises made by Winston, none of those things are either on or necessarily on the table anymore. Now, if you only voted to get rid of Labour, you should still be happy. But if you voted, for example, for the foreign buyers tax to provide the income needed, the tax take needed to pay for tax cuts, that's gone. If you voted, for example, because you wanted Winston's penis police to make sure there was Winkies in the right toilet, that's gone. That's not going to be a thing. All these things that were promised before the election are not going to be there. Some will, but some of the big ones won't. They just won't. If you voted because you want a referendum on the principles of the treaty, I would say at the moment that's a bit 50-50. I don't think that will happen unless Luxon is so desperate that it's anyone, give them anything, I guess like Damien Grant. I'm sorry, I don't mean to bring the devil's name up in the house of the Lord that we're sitting in. Unless Luxon gets so desperate to just go, anything you need. We've got to get this over the line. That'll be the only way, because Luxon and National Party voters in general are against that. ACT supporters, ACT funders are for that. New Zealand First supporters are for that. I don't think Winston's for that personally. I think he plays a card and it's a race card. I don't think it's necessarily where he stands. He's a populist and he does this. He figures out what's going to get him elected and that's what he pushes through.